Welcome back, Troglodytes, to your daily dose of guitar information, the Trogly's Guitar Show. Today we're going to talk about 70s Stratocasters. There is a bunch of hate out there online for 70s Fender guitars. But is the hate deserved, or are these things just misunderstood? My background of guitars is 70s and 80s Gibsons, and they have a very similar history online, where people just hated these things until they started to finally understand them. So from a history standpoint, Fender can be separated into two different categories within the vintage realm. There's pre-CBS and CBS. CBS standing for Columbia Broadcasting System. So guitars and amplifiers made in 1964 or before are under Leo Fender's ownership, and they are worth a lot more simply just because of that. But when CBS bought the company in 1965, historically that's when you start to see prices drop on the used and vintage market. And why is that? Well, that's because CBS starts to change some things. It started small, it just started with the neck plate, but then they moved on and modified other things of the guitar and changed what finish they used from nitro to poly finishes. The quality control was not the best, and many spec changes occurred. I thought it was nice that Reverb actually put together this little graph that kind of helps you understand the value of vintage Strats. So in the 50s, you can see right here, crazy high prices. Those are golden era Strats. The 60s, while still valuable, not quite as valuable as the 50s, but then, 1971, woo! Everything just falls down flat on the vintage market. You're looking around 2000 or less on guitars made between like 72 through 1980. So what are the features that make these 70s Strats so hated? One of the biggest things that happened in 1971 was the switch from a 4-bolt neck to a 3-bolt neck. Now, despite the name bolt, they're actually just screws. It's just what we call them. Because if you say the neck is screwed on, that doesn't sound so secure, but bolted on, yes. And I was always told that this was a cost savings feature, but in my unboxing video, some people kind of helped steered me straight. While yes, they use less screws and there's less metal being used for the neck plate, and it does technically save them a little bit of money there, they introduced something else that actually made this slightly more expensive. The micro tilt system, and that's something that Fender still uses yet today in many models. Have this little Allen key adjustment that helps you adjust the neck angle without doing shims and taking the neck off. Now, a lot of purists will say that wood on wood is the best for the best tone, whereas this also introduces metal within the mix, so some people don't like that. But something that gives these 3-bolt necks kind of a bad name is the neck pockets in the 70s can kind of be a little bit sloppy at times. So many people will look down upon this style versus the old style 4-bolts for that reason. But our next feature that was introduced around the exact same time was the bullet truss rod. You see this thing sticking out the top. It looks a little bit goofy, but that is just a spec of the 70s that screams, hey, I'm an old Stratocaster from the unwanted era. It's kind of a quirky spec, but I like it because it looks a bit goofy. Previous to the bullet truss rod, you would just have the end of your skunk stripe at the face of the headstock. So you actually have truss rod adjustment at the top here, versus at the bottom of the neck that you'd have to remove the neck like on the vintage style Stratocasters in order to adjust your truss rod. Another feature is the double string tree, which came about around 1972, so around the same time. That's another little 70s characteristic. But here's the big one, the size of the headstock. In the 70s, they are much larger. I mean, do you see the difference here? This thing is tiny in comparison. But despite that always being attributed as a 70s spec, it was actually in December of 1965 when CBS changed the style of the headstock to this bigger one. Now, why did they do that? It's said that they did that to make the Fender logo bigger so people could see when other people were playing their guitars, and it kind of standardized the headstock shapes between like the Jazzmasters, Jaguars, and Stratocasters, things like that. But here you can see just how significantly different the headstock sizes are, and they kind of shaped it a little bit different. There's people out there that love the 70s style, and then there's the people that like the 50s style. Personally, I like the 50s style better on like reissue guitars. But when you're talking a real deal 70s Stratocaster, I think the giant headstock just works. The next thing that people always talk about when they think 70s Stratocasters are the weight. These are heavy guitars. They were using heavier woods because, well, that's what was in at the time, and it's probably just what was available. Guitars were starting to be a big commodity thing. They were mass producing them. But from what I've read online, guys thought heavier guitars at that time meant more sustain. And there's a lot of people that still believe that yet today. So while most modern day players, they prefer lighter weight instruments because it's easier on their backs to do the gigging, at the time, that's not necessarily what people were going for. So it's kind of a spec that you just have to learn to live with, but you can find uncommonly lightweight examples from the 70s, so it's not all of them. And if you have a really nice looking lightweight Stratocaster from this era, you can expect to see a premium when you come to sell it. So that's why it's always a good idea to weigh your guitar when you're selling it. But perhaps the biggest spec change that people would actually agree was a good thing that happened in the 70s was the introduction of the 5-way switch. Now, I was always under the impression that that happened in like the late 60s, because I had a 79 Stratocaster as my first Strat like about 5 years ago. That was actually the first video on this channel that was guitar related, and that 79 had a 5-way switch. But when the consignee brought this guitar to me, he said factory 3-way switch. And I was like, what? There's no way. There's no way they still had a 3-way switch here. But yeah, it's true. 1976 was the last year for the 3-way blade style switch. They start to kind of transition, but 77, from what I've read, is the first official year where you don't have to just hope you can get that in-between sound. Like this one, it's really hard to get the neck and middle position together, but it is possible. It doesn't like to stay too much. But your middle and bridge, that one's a little bit easier to get on this one. Now there's ways around this. You can put paper in it and things like that. And just a few other 70s facts here just for fun. Hardtail Stratocasters became a little bit more common. So yeah, you can find pre-CBS models as soon as March of 1955 that were hardtail. But on the used market, it seems a hardtail is a little bit more readily available within a 70s model. Now, what does a hardtail Strat even mean if you're confused? Well, if we take this off, this does not have a tremolo system. It is a string through body design. So you actually have more wood in this model. There's no springs, nothing to mess around with. A lot of people love these guitars. There's actually a cult following for hardtail Stratocasters. Going back to my Antigua story, I didn't know what I was buying at the time. The first one I got, it had an issue where the fret was way too worn on it and the dealer didn't disclose it, so I returned it. And when I bought my second one, I was surprised to find that I no longer had a tremolo system. I just thought all Strats had them. But no, there are hardtail and trem versions of Stratocasters in this era that you need to be aware of. But there's a devout following for hardtail Strats, as people say it gives it a more focused attack and better sustain. And the last topic I'll talk about are cool finishes. When I think 70s Stratocaster, I think of this mocha or walnut color. It's kind of a cool translucent finish here, and it's what a lot of people consider the 70s finish. So a lot of people who are just buying one for their collection, they'll go for this color, because nothing says 70s and 80s like walnut furniture brown anyways. But the one I always think of is Antigua. That's such a cool finish. But another one I think of is silver. In 1979, they did a 25th anniversary silver Stratocaster. But you can also find other common finishes like natural, black, sunburst. There's a few Olympic whites and blondes out there. So now that we understand what makes a 70s Stratocaster different from a modern day Strat, what is my opinion of this guitar? This is a consignment piece that somebody brought me, so I have absolutely no money into this, so it doesn't matter if I like the guitar or not. So I can be 1,000 completely % honest, just as I always am, even when I do have money in guitars. The guy who bought this, he bought it because it was his birth year guitar, 1976. He wanted it strictly for that reason. But he got it and he didn't like it. It just wasn't for him. And usually when somebody brings me a guitar with that story, what that means is it's not set up properly. So when I sighted this one on my bench, it's like, yep, now I know why it doesn't play so well. it had a huge bow in the neck. Now, not like a warp or anything, it just needed a truss rod adjustment. So after a few days of letting that sit into place, it's now a nice straight neck. I kind of dialed the action in a little bit more, and this went from being a really, really stiff feeling guitar to something that is a lot more enjoyable to play. But I will say it does still feel a little bit more stiff than a regular Stratocaster, but I think that can also have something to do with this not being a tremolo version. So as far as playability goes, I didn't find anything that made this an inferior guitar. The only thing I noticed was that stiffness, and yes, it is a chunky Stratocaster. So if you're adverse to a heavy guitar, definitely do not buy one of these things unless you're finding and paying a premium for one of the lightweight ones. But I think what ultimately is going to sell this guitar to just about anybody is just how beautiful this example is. You've got a very nice, what I believe to be an ash body on this. Look at that beautiful wood grain underneath this Mocha finish. Not all 70s Stratocasters are going to quite look like this one. It's just such a beautiful example here, front to back. But if body wood isn't enough, you actually have some flame figuring within this neck. It's nothing like crazy, but it's just enough to make you go, yes, I love that. Especially on the face of the headstock where you have this golden lacquer. And you even have some on the fretboard. So first impressions of this thing, once I dialed it in, I was okay with it. It's just kind of a heavier guitar. But to learn a little bit more about the detailed specs of this instrument, let's go ahead and throw it on the workbench and take a look at its individual parts. Inside the 76 Stratocaster, not too much going on here, it's just a very basic design. So you have 3 single coil routes, so if you want to put a humbucker in here like a lot of people did, and yeah, you're going to have to do some additional routing, so it's very important to check the originality of your Stratocasters that are vintage because a lot of things could have happened to them in their 40+ year life. This one appears to be original to the best of my knowledge, but if you see anything that stands out, definitely let me know. But here's what the routes look like, and now onto the back side of the pickguard. The pickups in this era are referred as gray bottoms due to the fiber backing that's on them. And what's nice about these things is they actually have date stamps that are usable, kind of like pot codes. So your first 2 are your operator number, so this is operator 24. This is your week, so the 14th week of 1976. And you can see they all have them. Sometimes it's easier to read on certain examples than others. I would say this bridge pickup is the easiest one to read that 76 though. So 18th week, 14th week, and I would guess this one also says 18th week. But if we move on to our pot codes here, 137 is the manufacturer, and then 76 for the year, 06 for the week. And sometimes these will actually be on the sides of the pots. Then the 3-way switch has a patent number on it right there, and it says Made in USA right there. And you just have some partial shielding right here. I believe it's around 1980 when they start shielding the whole thing. But now let's take a look at the plastics. Apparently this is kind of like a big transitioning period between the cream into black. But very shortly after this, it just all becomes black. So having the cream plastics is actually a slightly desirable feature here from what I'm understanding. And you've got the hardtail bridge here, so you don't have to worry about any type of tremolo system. I'm sure it's just drilled directly to the top. You can see the 3 screws there, but I don't want to mess with the intonation too much to remove that. But the knobs kind of have a cool greenish hue to them. I'm not sure if that's just, dirt and grime building up in there. And you can see a lot of the markings for this has been kind of worn off. And as we saw earlier, this one still has the original ashtray cover over it. You don't always find that, but it's kind of nice when you do have it. There's not too much going on within the output jack route, but you can see the bare wood right there, and just a pretty basic output jack. As far as pickup readings go, the bridge pickup is 5.67, middle position 5.57, and the neck about the same, 5.68. We'll see if I can get those middle positions here. There you go, 2.85, then those two together, 2.84. And before we seal this puppy back up, there is one more thing I want to talk about here. Remember how we were talking about sloppy neck joins? I believe what they're talking about is little areas like right here. You see how the neck isn't completely flush with the body right there? There's just a very small gap. I think that's what people are talking about when they have sloppy neck pocket routes. This one doesn't look too bad to me, but you could shim it if you wanted to, and all that extra wood that you would add in here would just be hidden by the pickguard. But I'll leave that up to the next owner.
We'll take a quick look around this ash body as well. You can definitely see all those beautiful wood grains. I was looking on Reverb. There is one that's more beautiful on Reverb. It's kind of got a lighter colored finish with a little bit more wood grain, and it's in cleaner condition, but it does not have what this neck has. So what's really beautiful about this 21 fretted Stratocaster is, as I was showing you earlier, you've got some really cool wood grain in this thing. And it's not just wood grain, it's also got some flamed figuring to it. This kind of helps show you that right here, even on the fretboard. But what I really love about this one, besides just here on the fretboard, is this headstock. It's something you're always going to see every day when you're playing it. And I think that's what makes this example super special, because usually the maple's pretty plain. But you can definitely tell somebody liked to play in the cowboy chord area on this one. You do have some considerable fret wear, especially on the second and first fret. By the third fret, it starts to kind of even out, and then once you go up here, you just kind of have very minor wear. So do you want to do a level recrown job? Maybe. Does it necessarily need it 100%? No, you can play it straight out of the box. But you do get a little bit of fret buzz, and you could probably stand to raise the action a little bit. I think my setup job on this was almost a little bit too low for most people's preferences. As far as neck specs, I get 1.57 inches at the nut. That increases to 1.98 at the 12th. First fret neck depth, 0.88. That increases to 0.93 by the 12th. And as usual, 25.5 inch scale length on these guys. It appears we have the original nut on here, but I do want to make a mention of these fret ends. What I believe has happened here is this had some fret sprout at one point in time, so somebody kind of filed down the edges, and in doing that you can see some areas where the finish kind of got chipped. So it was either the fret sprouting that did that, or where they were working on the guitar that did those small things. But right here, you can definitely see where somebody's file got the finish more, because, you know, it's kind of hard to work in that area, so they got a little bit lazy. The same thing's true right here. You can see where they got the finish, and it looks like they slightly got the fretboard right here too, because that is the only area of wear that I see on the fretboard top. But you definitely have it along the edges. Maybe somebody was actually trying to roll the neck a little bit. That's always a possibility too when you got a little bit of bare wood showing. But moving on to the face of the headstock here, you can see that beautiful bullet truss rod. You just adjust that with an Allen key at the top there. You've got the dual string trees, as we were talking about earlier, and vintage style tuners. That's something else that's kind of special to these 70s models, is you've got the F stamping on the back that we'll see later on. But this is the type you just put the string down and wrap it around the post. And here you can see that infamous 70s Stratocaster logo. And you'll also notice that the edge of the headstock right here, it's slightly more ambered in color. I'm guessing these are like cigarette, almost like burns, or maybe something got on the finish at one point in time. It's kind of cool, or maybe it just got more sunlight than the rest of the headstock, who knows? And now with the neck off, we can learn a little bit more. So you can find various things on the back side of these necks, but the biggest thing that you're going to want to learn about is this. This is that whole new micro tilt system. So essentially what you've got going on here is you have two little metal circles that collide right there, and from the back you can adjust this little thing that protrudes to adjust the neck angle without taking your neck off. So that is a metal on metal type thing. So this is the reason why they switched to a 3 bolt-on neck. But actually take a look at the screws that are used on here. So you've got 2 wood screws like you would normally find on these things, but the third one is actually threaded within these metal bits. And as you can see, you know, that is much different. This is the first time I've ever seen one of these things. So you could almost actually really call this thing a bolt. So that's kind of a cool little feature. Now let's learn about date stamps. So this is one variation you can find. 09 tells you what model it belongs to, which I believe 09 is Stratocaster. And then the next 2 digits are supposed to tell you what fretboard material it originally had. I can't even read what it says. But then the last 4 is what we're most interested in. So that looks like 1365 to me. So that 13 means the 13th week of this next digit, which is a 6, which would be 1976. So it's the 13th week of 1976, made on the 5th day of the week. So that means this was a Friday guitar. And then within the neck pocket cavity, you can sometimes find a 4-digit code that's very similar to what the date stamp is on the neck. So this one looks like either a 13 or a 15, 6, and an 8. So that would be the 13th or 16th week, 1976. And that would be the day of production. I really cannot make out what that's supposed to say, though. Then you can see the quality control stamp right there and a few other things that don't mean too much. And then 76 was the last year for this style of serial number on the neck plate. After 76, they started to put them on the face of the headstock right under the Fender logo. So 76 into 77, that's a pretty big deal, with a bunch of small changes that I never realized. But moving on to the back side of the body here, here's where you can really see the beauty of this guitar shine through. If you thought the wood grain on the front was good, I love the back. Now, another characteristic of these 70s Stratocasters are you have tons of body pieces in here. So this guy appears to be a 3-piece body, which most of the translucent finishes are. But under the solid finishes, people have found, 4, 5, 6, it's kind of like the Norland era. They just used whatever they could. But this is just kind of a beautiful mashup right here. And underneath the neck plate, just in case you're curious what this looks like, you actually have 4 screw holes. 3 of them for your regular screws, and then 1 for your micro tilt adjustment. Which if you look in there just right, you can see the hex key that adjusts that micro tilt. But other than that, you just kind of have your typical Strat contour right here for your belly. Just a little bit more on the serial numbers here before we move on. It's not necessarily a number that you can read, it's more of a production number that started in the late 50s and it keeps going on. So this is like the 665,000th Stratocaster made. And that'll help you approximately get what date this is. So everything combined here, date stamps all over this guitar, the parts and all that stuff, it's pretty safe to assume that this is an early 1976 Stratocaster. And back here you can see the walnut skunk stripe with the beautiful quilting and slightly flamey neck here. It's such a magnificent treat. I'm so glad I get to document this one because, again, they're not all as nice as this one. This is definitely a beautiful treat on the headstock especially. And the last feature that we have to cover here are the F-stamp tuners, which also started in the late 60s but are more closely attributed to these 70s models. And here's what your Strat buttons are looking like on the edge of the instrument. All assembled and ready to go, it lives up to the reputation. 9 pounds, 9.8 ounces. So about 9.5 pounds. I mean, in Les Paul land, that's a pretty good weight. But in Stratocaster world, that's like, what, a pound or 2 heavier than most people would prefer. So let's go ahead, plug it in, and hear how it sounds.
Now that we understand the 70s Stratocasters a little bit better, what are my final thoughts on this thing? First, let's talk tone. It is such a glassy sounding Stratocaster. It's a very vintage-esque tone to it, but I noticed when you actually jam it within the middle positions here, the output is slightly less, but it is good to know that you can still get those in-between sounds despite it not being a 5-way blade switch. Listening back to the recording, I noticed in the clean tones, it didn't seem like there was much bass. Maybe you could add that with your amp or roll the tone down a little bit to get more of that. However, I thought it was perfect just the way it was with a little bit of dirt on it. Great clarity. I noticed that the neck pickup didn't quite have as much character as I'm used to. I'm guessing that needs to be raised a little bit because these pickups are very low. But other than that, I did not have too many complaints. I thought it sounded good. But how is the feel? Like, the first 10 frets or so, it feels like just a regular guitar and it feels nice. But after about the 12th fret, I find it's just a little bit stiff, especially the top 2 strings. Now, this might just be me not jiving with the 7¼ inch radius. I find myself preferring those compound radiuses that I kind of started Strats with, because I had the same complaints on that vintage style Daybreak Strat that we reviewed a couple of days ago. But there's a few ways to get around that if you can't live with the feel of this thing. You could either get a lighter set of strings on here. I'm not quite sure what gauge is on here right now, but if you went down to like 8s or 9s, that might make you a little bit more slinkier. You could down tune it. A lot of people tune their guitars down half a step anyway, so that's definitely one way to get a slinkier feel. You could get it professionally set up. Remember, when I got this thing, it was really stiff. I dialed it in to a point that I felt that it was comfortable to play, but there's probably some other fine tweaking things that you could do to make the setup even better. And the fourth thing, practice. I noticed when I'm sitting down and playing this thing, the stiffness doesn't bother me as much, but when I'm standing, it's definitely harder to do those bends. As far as the aesthetic look of this thing, it's on point. It's a piece of history. And I'm going to go ahead and go on the record and say, I think just like the Norlin era of Gibson, the 70s Fenders are just slightly misunderstood. Sure, they come from the bean counter days when somebody bought a successful company and they're trying to scale it and make as much money possible by selling as many guitars as possible. And they made some changes to make them more stylistically pleasing to the new owners, as well as to make manufacturing easier. But some of these mods are actually kind of cool that they did to these things. I mean, the micro tilt I think is the biggest thing, and I definitely have a new appreciation for the 3-bolt neck. The only reason people hate on these things is because they weren't this way in the 50s and 60s, and that's kind of how the internet started. It's the people who grew up with these guitars, and when these were brand new, they were garbage in comparison to the used ones of the day. So they spread their disdain throughout the internet in the early days. People are kind of looking back at this era nostalgically. So you'll probably see these things continue to raise in price. And yes, they live up to their reputation. They're heavy guitars. So if I could only choose one Stratocaster, would a 70s Strat be it? No, I probably wouldn't. There are so many Fender eras, from the expensive 50s and 60s to the slightly more affordable 70s, but the 80s is kind of a weird and mysterious time. But there's so many Stratocasters to choose from at varying price points, made from Mexico to Japan to all these other places, that there are definitely guitars that are better deals than these, but these are kind of classics, and you pay a little bit extra to own a classic. They can't be that bad if Fender makes reissues of these guitars, right? So, if you think you're interested in being the next owner of this beautiful Mocha example hardtail Stratocaster, let's go ahead and review its condition. Condition-wise, this thing's in pretty good shape. It's definitely been played though, so if you're looking for a mint condition collectible, unless you take this to a professional buffer and like buff all these scratches out, it's probably not going to fit your definition of mint. But let's go ahead and go over this. As we were kind of talking earlier, on the face of the headstock, the edges along the tuners are kind of a darker color. I'm not quite sure what caused that. It could be potentially a cigarette being by here, or it could just be that it sat in the sunlight more often than the rest of the headstock. But you've got various impressions and light scratches on the face here. On the side here, when you're playing, sometimes you can kind of see some lines and stuff on here. I'm not quite sure what that is. It blacklights just fine, so it's not an overspray or anything, but I definitely want you to be aware of that. And around the ball end of the headstock, you do have some edge wear along the sides. Nothing too crazy, but definitely stuff you should be aware of, because pretty much all the edges of this instrument have some wear. As we saw on the workbench, there's definitely considerable fret wear on the first 2 frets, and kind of moderate fret wear for the rest. You could level and recrown it to make it play better, but you're gonna be okay with it straight out of the box. The action's set up pretty low. I would honestly suggest to raise it just a little bit if you want completely buzz-free action. But the way I have it now, it plays perfectly fine. As far as the top of the guitar goes, I'll just run the light over it here so you can see all of the fine scratches on here. You're going to have some handling marks as well. The biggest thing condition-wise is right here by the output jack. It looks like somebody was trying to get their lead in there, but it didn't quite make it into the jack, so it kind of scratched the finish in a deep way. There's no way you could polish that puppy out. But all these other micro fine scratches, if you use an abrasive type of compound, I bet you could get them out. Maybe even the ones on the pickguard. Kind of a small thing here, but the pickguard is slightly lifting right there. So that'll catch your eye, but I don't think it's going to off-put anybody from buying this. Now moving on to the back side of the headstock, just some light wear and tear, mainly around the edges as we were looking at before here. Looks like you might have a light stand mark right here where the finish was worn through. Then as far as the neck goes, there's a very small indentation right there. Very minor. Honestly, most dealers probably wouldn't even disclose that. But on consignment pieces, I like to point everything out because I don't want anybody to be disappointed. And it looks like maybe a very small ding right here. Or maybe it's just a discoloration in the wood. And other than that, it's just kind of the finish worn off by the edges of the frets from whoever cured the fret sprout. And again, that little area right here. And we'll see all this in the blacklight test. But there is one little thing that you should know, is there is a very small neck pocket crack. It's on the bass side. It's just a small little stress crack. I didn't notice it affecting the guitar by any means. And you can see right here is a very small area where the finish was chipped. Now moving on to the back, there's tons of buckle worming marks on here. It's nothing that, destroys the finish, but it's definitely there and I want you to be aware of it. We'll just kind of shine the light over it here. And the edges of the instrument definitely have some wear as well that we'll go over. It's a pretty presentable back here, but you can definitely see the wear once you get it in the light. And now once we go along the edges, you're going to see a few areas of worn finish. The first one being right here. You can see there's a ding plus a bunch of fine scratches here. And then once you kind of get to the arm contour over here, there's a line right there by the bottom strap button where I'm guessing that might have been a strap that just naturally kind of rubbed through the finish a little bit right there. But other than that, I mean, it's got wear and tear, but it's definitely a pretty clean example of a 1976 Stratocaster. This thing looks pretty cool under blacklight. You got a little bit of sweat absorption in here, so it's going to glow a little bit more, but the rest of the face of the guitar is looking pretty good here. All your plastics glow the way I would expect to see. So it's looking cool here. Moving up the neck, here's how you can kind of see those areas I was talking about where the finish kind of got rubbed off. So you've got it all along the edges right there, as well as that little bit on the fretboard. Then once again, you can see those small areas of finish missing along the edges of the neck. I'm sure most vintage Strats have something very similar going on. Unless they were kept in a really humidity controlled environment their entire life and never played out. And here you can kind of see what I was talking about, that darker area of the headstock. It does blacklight differently, so something's definitely gone on there. But you can see the edges of the headstock are definitely glowing nicely, and you can kind of see those slightly worn areas here as well. This is what makes the blacklight test so beautiful. These small areas that are kind of hard to catch in regular lighting situations just pop out like a sore thumb on these vintage guys here. And here you can see the neck is in clean shape. Just that one little spot right there, and you can see it definitely broke the finish there, so it's probably likely within the wood, but it's a fairly common area for Stratocasters to get those. So, kind of a cool little Strat under blacklight. This instrument comes in a hard shell case. Despite the guitar being all original, this is not the original case. Something happened to that. But kind of similar in style. The original one just would have said Fender on here and probably would have been a little bit of a better fit. So we've got 1, 2, 3 latches and a functioning handle here. And sometimes it's kind of hard to open this case. It likes to lock itself over there, so you got to give it a little bit of a tug there and then it's good to go. And the lid does not support itself, but it does support the guitar in here pretty good. I'll put some extra padding in here to completely secure the fit as well. But to be honest with you, the fit really isn't that bad. A little bit of bubble wrap will completely secure that up. So, if you think you might be interested in being the next owner of this 1976 Fender Stratocaster, you can check out that link in the description, which will take you to the Reverb for sale page. Thank you, Troglodytes, for tuning in today. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and we will see you tomorrow on the next episode. Take care.